It's go time.
Welcome everyone to Third Down Gamble with your hosts, Don Charbin and Heath Graham.
And welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Don here along with Heath. Heath, we've seen a lot of activity in this communication window that the CFL started on February the 2nd. Fascinating how quickly a lot of these signings came about. Does that mean there was some discussion beforehand? Of course. Does it matter? To me, not. But first, before we get into that minutia, let's talk about what was coming sort of out of left field to me, was that the salary cap for the 2025 season is up significantly over what is anticipated the ceiling would be.
The report is about a $400,000 increase in the salary cap based on some revenue generation from the 2024 season, which indicates it was a successful season from the money-making standpoint. Interesting that they announced it halfway through the negotiation window as the timing for it. It sounds like some teams were caught a little bit off guard, and now we wait and see if any of these players that have agreed to terms with the team maybe don't sign that contract because their original team may have something more in their pocket that they can offer.
Well, I just wonder in a circumstance like this, yes, the timing may have been a little bit difficult, but I kind of find it hard to believe that teams wouldn't have known going into free agency that this was going to be there. There must have been some whispers, some memos, something that would have indicated. So they would have had a fairly good idea about what that number would be. Most teams, regardless, hedge a bit anyway. They leave enough if there's injuries, if there's somebody that isn't wanting to be a part of the team anymore and they want to be released, you got to find someone to replace. Those types of things happen all the time. So I find it a little bit like crying wolf in a sense that you didn't know and it's impacting your ability to sign because, yeah, to a point, but you still knew what the old cap was. How many contracts would that impact?
It might not impact a lot of contracts, but it might impact some bigger contracts. If all of a sudden you've got another $40,000 or $50,000 that you can offer somebody that's looking to make in that 200 range, that's a pretty significant bump. And we are left in that wait and see. I'm happy for the players that there's an additional $400,000 per team available to them. That's not an insignificant amount, and it just shows the strength of the league, that things are moving in the right direction. A lot of teams have made wish lists going into this free agency. They've got their wish list of guys from their own team that they want to re-sign, and they have players that they're targeting from other teams. This gives them a little bit more to play with, and as we've seen, activity has been very brisk.
Just to give some more context to this 400,000, it's 412,365 that was added to the salary cap over and above the 5.65 million that was going to be there originally. But if you look at it to last year's salary cap, which was 5.525, it's actually up 537,365. That's a 9.7% increase according to 3Down. That's some good indication that this league is getting stronger and stronger. And I want to take a little bit of that out of this, that the league itself, revenue streams have to be better, gate receipts have to be better, and if those two markers are working well, they have the agreement based on the 2022 baseline that if we're going to be better than this baseline in the future, then roughly 25 cents out of every dollar that you're over and above goes back into the expenditure cap, the salary cap, and you can pay the players more. Now, for the CFLPA, they love this. They have sort of the final say as to whether or not it goes ahead. It's provided to them. And I doubt they would ever say no, but there may be a circumstance where they may feel that we'll wait another year, just see how this plays out.
Very true. And you mentioned the gate revenue must be increased. And if you look at attendance across the league, we continue to see strong support in Winnipeg and Saskatchewan. BC made huge strides in attendance this year. The Argonauts were up as well. The biggest concerns were the Alberta teams, and I strongly believe that the Edmonton Elks are trending in the right direction with the coaching changes and the personnel changes that they have made. I expect their attendance to increase significantly this year over what we've seen in the previous 2 seasons. The Calgary Stampeders are the other question mark, and the fans in Calgary have been so used to supporting a winner that I think it's been pretty tough on them the last couple of seasons to see them slide down the standings. If they start to bounce back and be more competitive, I expect that attendance in Calgary will come back as well.
They've got to do something, I would imagine. And if Calgary is going to see an uptick in attendance, they're going to have to be good out of the gate. They're going to have to find a way to win football games early, get people motivated to being there. There's already so much detritus that you can argue that hangs around McMahon Stadium. That stadium is starting to show its age. Whether or not the Stamps can get a new stadium or you can retrofit that one to make it far better, the thing that I would love to see is just put a canopy over the 2 stands so that you're less weather afflicted. But beyond that, what else do you do with that stadium? You have to gut the insides of it, make it more fan-friendly.
That's the biggest challenge for the Stampeders right now. Not only the on-field product, but a lot of people have a negative attitude towards McMahon Stadium as it currently stands. And it's not going to be a cheap investment to get that up to a higher standard. We saw even the players in their report card that the players generated this year. Calgary was lacking in some areas, and it's bad optics for a team to try to draw new talent when the players that are already there have some pretty negative things to say about the facilities.
Well, the facilities in terms of the players, I find that odd that they would pick on the facilities because the workout room, the area where they have treatment for injuries, the area that they can go get cold ice baths, everything like that, that's almost state of the art. They were one of the first ones through the door with all of that. It may be showing its age a bit. The bigger thing that I would say, it's just this whole idea of when you go to a game, McMahon Stadium, because it's up on a hill, it's more subject to cooler climes. It's colder up there. I talking to the Stampeders play-by-play crew. They have said that it can almost have its own climate on some days, and it's just a tougher sell. Weather is always going to be a big factor when it comes to football because it is an outdoor game except for BC. The weather is going to impact you. That's why I think that some sort of canopy roof, anything over in McMahon, not the playing field, just part of the stands, 3/4 of the way out, whatever you want to do for the stands, just to get so people aren't so exposed out there. They're a little more protected.
Winnipeg and Saskatchewan fans would argue that the weather can affect them a lot more in those cities than you would expect in Calgary, and they still have pretty substantial crowds as well. I think it's finding excuses and nitpicking a little bit as well. We've all sat through games at Old Taylor Field, Old Winnipeg Stadium, etc. We know the era of McMahon Stadium, and when you compare it to game day experiences at some of the newer stadiums right now that are out there, you can see why they feel a little bit less than. Unfortunately, as I said, it's a pretty substantial investment to try to get it up to scale. And of course, when you're dealing with the province of Alberta, the competition between Calgary and Edmonton, if one gets something new, the other one is going to scream forward as well. So if there's any provincial funding going into that, now you've got 2 major centers competing for those dollars.
You do, but if you're budgeting, then you just allow for both. It's not that hard to do. You maybe don't stage it so that they both get them the same day, but maybe Calgary gets their new facility or at least a retrofit of McMahon this year and Edmonton gets it 3 years down the road. I don't think anyone really would get that uptight about it. I mean, heavens, they built a brand new hockey rink in Edmonton. They've got the Saddle Dome in Calgary that has been talked about needing repair, and they've lived with it I shouldn't say repair, but the Flames have thought about moving from there for years, and it was flooded during that great flood of the Bow River a few years back. That stadium may be on its last legs, and there's another entity that wants that money. So you're thinking about just football, but yeah, it impacts hockey and other sports as well.
New general manager Ed Hervey has been very busy in the negotiation window, as well as re-signing some of the in-house Edmonton Elks. What's been the biggest impact that you've seen so far from Ed Hervey this offseason?
The biggest impact that I've seen is that he's almost gotten rid of every major signing of Chris Jones. McLeod Bethel-Thompson is gone. Eugene Lewis, gone. Boris Beattie, they're all out the door. And it's him putting his own stamp on the franchise. Now, part of it is bringing back some of the people that Jones had traded away. Jake Serezna, I think, is a huge re-get for the Edmonton Elks. The other one that we had kind of mused about with Dave Thomas on this podcast was Terrell Ford, and they got him. They've got a 2-year deal with him, and that's hurting Winnipeg, I'm sure.
It is, and to speak about Jake Serezna, it was a big shock last year when he was traded to Toronto for Curly Gittins Jr. It shows that he was really at home in Edmonton as well, so not really surprising to see him back. The big splash, I agree, is Terrell Ford coming over from Winnipeg to join brother Trey on that Elks team. The Bombers are not a team that likes to overpay for defensive backs. He's a Canadian, which changed things a little bit, but they let Demario Houston walk to the Calgary Stampeders in the previous offseason as well. They've had a knack for finding quality defensive backs coming up out of the States. This is a huge hole to fill because I don't know if there's many that are faster than Terrell Ford in this league, but it's a big win for the Elks.
The Elks, and especially Ed Hervey, they were going to make a statement this year. They wanted to get fans back in the seats. They wanted to show the new ownership that they were serious about what they wanted to do with that franchise. And I really felt, I think it was 8 signings that they made on day one of this communication window. Granted, they're not full-fledged signings until February 11th. That's when you actually put pen to paper. But these have been both put forward to the CFLPA and to the CFL that there is an agree to terms. If you're going to sell the Elks in Edmonton, you have to do something to get back into the playoffs. Right from his first presser, he said he was going to be busy on free agent week, and he was also going to shore up the defense. Niles Morgan was a re-sign. He got a contract extension. That was huge. But you look at the most of the effort that has been going on with Edmonton. It's Jake Serezna, it's Robbie Smith, it's Jared Brinkman, Terrell Ford. These are defenders. He wanted to shore up that defense.
President Chris Morris spoke about closing the revolving door as he was taking charge of this team. This is a bit of a revolving door right now, but we knew this was coming. This was their chance to establish what they want to present as the Double E football team moving forward. As you said, they're shedding some of the weight that Chris Jones had brought in. This is their stamp on the team, and it'll be really fun to watch these players come together and gel. And next offseason is the one that's going to be really telling for the Edmonton Elks, whether they continue to make this big of a splash in free agency or if they are really happy with the moves that they have made so far this offseason, and this is the core that they want to develop.
I touched on the Chris Morris thing in our last podcast. I really think it merits some rehash, because for you to get a franchise and keep them together, you have to have a starting point, which means you're probably going to be changing a lot of things to reestablish the base. So I said at that time that it was probably going to be a 2-year plan before we start to see the Elks settle down and that they start re-signing players as opposed to signing free agents. This is year 1 of that process. This is how you bring back the core, or you sign a new core like Royce Metier, who could be there. He could be there long term too. That would be a great pairing in that defensive backfield. The Elks are trying to do it right now with making a major statement that we are meaning business and we are going to be competitive, trying to draw other players to them because of that. And then once you're there, that's when the sell job is. You got to, A, follow what we want from you in this franchise, be a good corporate citizen, be a good citizen, and be a great football player. And the rest will follow. We'll find ways to make you stand out in the community.
They've shored up some veterans, but they've also brought in some youth. As we mentioned, Terrell Ford, Keon Julian Grant are a couple of young players that are going to be that nucleus moving forward along with Trey Ford. And I think that's a big marketing opportunity for the Elks. Having those Ford brothers, one on offense, one on defense, is going to create some excitement, especially given that they are Canadian talent.
Well, and as Dave Thomas pointed out, the Elks showed a lot last year. They had that horrible start, but they came out of it and were pushing for the playoffs near the end of the season. They fell short, but this is their move now to get over that hurdle and get back into the playoffs. And having them make some noise in the playoffs would be great for the West. It would juggle the West a little bit before we get too far away from the Elks. The Blue Bombers have lost some serious talent and kept some serious talent.
They have. They obviously had, again, key guys that they wanted to have back. The toughest decision was likely at receiver with Dalton Schoen and Kenny Lawler, both being outstanding receivers and looking for money. They made the decision that Schoen was the guy that they wanted to keep. Kenny Lawler has agreed to terms with the Hamilton Tiger Cats at this point, so he's moving on. Again, following former assistant GM Ted Gavea to Hamilton. We've seen a few Bombers move in that direction. They've got their offensive line pretty shored up. I believe they lost Liam Dobson. Is that right? Liam Dobson also to Hamilton, but other than that, the O-line is pretty intact. The biggest change for the Bombers has been on that defensive line. They brought back Jake Thomas. They brought back Willie Jefferson. Other than that, there's going to be an almost all new defensive line for the Bombers.
The Argonauts picking up Celestin Haba, for instance, plucking him out of Winnipeg. It's the joy of being the top team. You can hang on to them for so long, but then eventually there's going to be some cracks and other teams are going to come poaching, and that's exactly what's been happening. Terrell Ford being out of that secondary in Winnipeg is going to be massive. I don't care what you say about how much a defensive back makes an impact in the game. He is going to be massive, and I don't know how they recover because that's a lot of work to find somebody that good.
It is. And just back to the defensive line, James Waters is coming over from the Calgary Stampeders. That's a guy, obviously, that the Bombers were targeting, which allowed them to say goodbye to Garbutt and Haba and move on from them. The secondary is for sure the biggest concern on defense for Winnipeg right now. Brandon Alexander is an aging veteran that I don't know if they're going to be wanting to keep him around as well. So that might be a couple of holes on that secondary that are going to need to be filled. The big playability of Terrell Ford is going to be a hard one to fill.
Hey, George Hopkins, Calgary Stampeders Equipment Manager. You're listening to the Third Down Podcast. Enjoy it. I do.
We touched on it. Kenny Lawler, according to 3 Down, was the number one free agent that was left when this process started. He was gone to Hamilton fairly quick in this process. Once we get going down this list that they had compiled of the top 30, there aren't many left. Most of them have been signed. Ceresna to Edmonton, Terrell Ford to Edmonton as well. David Beard goes back to Edmonton. You can start to see where Edmonton was focusing. Eugene Lewis leaves to go to Ottawa. Damon Webb leaves to go to the Stampeders. Jared Brinkman, who I thought was an up-and-coming defensive lineman in Toronto and showed a lot last year, but I wonder how deep that Argonauts defensive line is because they got picked over. The Elks, again, making sure they got him. Now, Deshaun Amos is the top of the rest that are still available, and Deshaun Amos has not been re-signed. The Argonauts are shedding weight. They are shedding salary to get back to under the salary cap. They've been over marginally the last couple of years, and I'm sure they just want to bring this back into alignment so that this burden isn't on them all the time.
Sean Amos is 30 years old. He's somebody that maybe the Bombers are targeting to fill that backfield situation. He would be a great asset for them, or really any team. The Argos may be trying to bring him back, but you're right. The age and salary are probably indicating that the Argonauts are looking to move on from him. Next on the list also with the Argonauts is offensive lineman Isaiah Cage. He's been with Toronto since 2018, won 2 Grey Cups with them. It seems like he's not going to be back with the Argonauts. Improvement on the offensive line is always something that general managers are looking to make, and this would be a good get for anybody.
Cage is an import. Typically, if you're going to load up on offensive line, you really want them to be nationals. Now, with him, if the Argonauts want to go all 5 up front, then he's going to be the odd man out. That's going to give him an opportunity to play elsewhere. Would Hamilton be interested? I'm not sure who else. Maybe BC would come knocking.
Yeah, we see Hamilton's already made a splash with Liam Dobson on the offensive line, a national, but a different position than Isaiah Cage. That might be a logical place for him. We know the Ticats love to bring ex-Argos in. It just makes them and their fans happy when they steal somebody away from T.O.
Exactly. It's one of the best rivalries out there. It doesn't get sold as much as it needs to because those two franchises by train are about 45 minutes apart. It's really close. It's kind of akin to Washington and Philly or Washington and Baltimore in other sports. It's that close. Robbie Smith, that one surprised me. I didn't even know that the Argonauts would move on from him, especially being a national and playing defensive line. But he's now in Edmonton. Who else? That one did surprise me. I thought for sure that given his status in Toronto, especially that 2022 Grey Cup, that they would be kind of high on him. And he played a lot of meaningful minutes in the Grey Cup this year.
He did. That one is a surprise to me as well. It will be hard for the Toronto Argonauts to replace some of the talent that is getting away from them. Obviously, they have a plan as well. And this is the fun part of the offseason is you look at all these teams on paper, you can figure out who you believe has improved the most and who has lost the most. But we really don't know until that regular season starts. There's guys that come out of nowhere, like Dalton Schoen in Winnipeg when he was a rookie. Nobody was expecting much from him. He lit the world on fire. We see guys all over the league that continue to do that. And you find those gems and those younger guys that'll save you several $1,000s in cap room, and they jump in somewhere and blow the doors off.
Well, this is why scouting is so important, being able to assess talent properly. You've got to be able to know what your team needs and how that person would adapt. Dalton Schoen is a great example, although the last 2 years he hasn't had much of a chance because of injury. But when he came out as a rookie, he was dynamite, and teams were having to re-scheme just to make sure that he would get all those yards. They are sort of, I think, with any professional football team, the diamonds in the rough. Every team hopes that they can find somebody like that. You don't always come away with it. But Ontario Wilson, for instance, last year, he had a breakout, especially in the last half of the season for the Blue Bombers. He's gone stateside to give it a go.
Keeping with the receivers, as we briefly mentioned, Keon Julian Grant also has moved teams and has agreed to terms with who else but the Edmonton Elks. We see, as we go down this list, not only have the Elks been active, but they've been active with some very high quality free agents. I think that's about 6 or 7 of the top 15, according to 3 Down Nation, that have gone over to the Elks.
If you look at that list, the top 15, it's dotted with Elk signings. Players that do surprise me that they're still out there. Kadeem Carey, for instance, who had been a Stampeder for quite a few years, moves over to Toronto, has a pretty good season with the Argonauts, but now as a running back, he's looking for a job. You've got Alexander Hollins, who was cut by the BC Lions to make room, I guess, for the signing of Justin McInnes. Is he going to land anywhere? He's a bit of a smaller receiver, and he was injured for part of last season.
Hollins was the guy that really started off hot at the beginning of the season and fell off towards the second half. He might be a bit of a risk. He's only 28 years old. If teams feel that they can get him back to that first 7 or 8 game level that he was in 2024, they'll be happy to have him. If he comes in and struggles, it's going to be a fair bit of money invested in a guy that you maybe aren't so happy with.
We don't know, too, and this is the other part of the equation that has to be countenanced. We don't know what the ask is. Sometimes these guys are still on the board because their ask is too high. It always brings me back to when we started this podcast. And there was one player, a receiver, that we couldn't believe wasn't playing, and yet never did play another down in the CFL because his ask was too high. That was DeVere Posey, who could not, after having some great seasons, get to a contract again. And sometimes we just don't know if the agent and the player are asking too much. We don't know. Usually we blame the player, but sometimes the agent is driving that engine.
Especially if the agent is representing players of similar caliber or similar position. They're often playing teams and playing a bit of a game. And we do see right now the players that teams are aggressively going after are signing those deals. There's other guys that are probably getting some offers, but maybe they haven't seen that number they want yet, and they run the risk of waiting too long. Going to number 23 on the list is the one that has surprised me the most that we haven't heard anything yet, and that's national linebacker Fraser Sopik last year with the Toronto Argonauts. I thought he really came on last year and was a great addition to that defense. Only 27 years old. There's a lot of football career still ahead of him, and I believe there's got to be some teams looking at him. Maybe they just haven't hit that price yet.
Well, Sopik, who was originally drafted by the Stampeders, there's a chance he might wind back up with that team, although I wonder again if it's the Hamilton Tiger Cats come knocking. He did play at Western. At 27, you're hitting the prime. This is it. This is when you're going to be at your best, from 27 to 31, typically, and then the fall off starts to go from there. Brandon Danridge, Ottawa Redblacks, still isn't out there, and at 28, again, right in that sweet spot of when you want to get somebody.
Again, a defensive back. We know there's some teams that are looking right now. Dandridge is a dangerous player and one who can pick off the ball. He can make those open field tackles. He scored in 2023. He scored 3 touchdowns, including 2 pick sixes and 1 off of a punt return. So he's got some speed and some good hands as well. I don't expect him to be one that's out there for too terribly long. He's just waiting for the right deal.
Well, I wonder if it's a situation where he's reviewing all of the offers coming to him. And for all we know, he's got 6 or 7 that are sitting on his desk. And he has to make a decision as to which way he want to go. And there's a lot of factors. Do you want to move? Cut that commute down a little bit. There's all these different things. It's not just what you do on the football field. It's sometimes when you're looking at the situation. And agents, I know they always get a bad name. Their job is to max out their players, right? That's what they're there for.
And you have to think when there's these guys that are probably fielding multiple offers, they're also reaching out to people that have played on those teams and know those organizations. It's a fraternity, and people that maybe you've played college football with, or that you've been through a training camp with, or spent some time on a roster. You're reaching out to those guys saying, hey, what have you heard about Ottawa? I know you've been there for 2 seasons. What are your thoughts? Is it worth me checking this out? That stuff has to go on as well. And to some degree, people may call that tampering, but it's also doing your homework. And I don't think it's anything untoward. I think it's making sure that you have all the information available to you when you make these, what can be life-altering decisions.
Exactly. It impacts your family. There's a lot of pieces that have to fall together. It's not the easiest thing to be from the southern United States and have to move to Canada for 6 months out of the year.
I'm going to jump down the list a little bit further here and think of a really fun scenario. Andrew Harris has signed with the Saskatchewan Roughriders as a coach, and there's a lot of talk back and forth between Winnipeg fans and Saskatchewan fans. A lot of history with Andrew Harris versus the Saskatchewan Roughriders. I'm looking at number 29 on this list, and defensive lineman Miles Brown, who played last year with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Wouldn't that be something if he ends up in blue and gold this year after having run-ins with both Zach Collaros and Chris Streveler?
And we talk about the fit. How would Chris Streveler, if he is re-signed by the Blue Bombers, and Miles Brown get along?
It's a scenario that I don't 100% think is going to happen, but one of the fun things about free agency is you start playing with the what ifs.
Third down.
We know this is a quarterback-driven league. We know that if you've got a good one, you want to hang on to him, and that's pretty much what happened with the starters this year. Vernon Adams Jr., a starter in BC, going to Calgary, and Jake Maier, a starter in Calgary, going to Saskatchewan. You could say McLeod Bethel-Thompson and Cody Fajardo, but that was a straight-up trade. There are other players, though, that have starts in this league that haven't signed yet. Nick Arbuckle is back with the Argonauts, the Grey Cup hero, who really played well in that big game. You go next, it's Jeremiah Mazzoli. Ottawa has said they're going to move on. And does that mean it's the end of the line for Mazzoli?
It might be. I think there might be some value to have him on a roster. I just don't know where the best fit for him is. And we see the Ottawa Red Blacks have under contract now. They've got Drew Brown, they've got Dustin Crum, and they've got Tyree Adam. Jeremiah Mazzoli was the veteran presence on that team. Very valuable last year when Drew Brown went down to injury at his age and overcoming the injuries that he's had. I don't know if he's going to be happy being a third string anywhere, and unfortunately that might be what's staring him in the face.
I don't know if being a third string would be the worst case scenario for him. And if I'm a team and I've got a chance to get Jeremiah Mazzoli on my roster and he's still interested, I would go for it. My thinking is he's a glue guy. He's a type of guy that brings teams together. Players rally to him. If he can be somewhere to help out, why not? Get him over there and be a tutor to the starter, be a tutor to the backup, and help a team along.
BC Lions?
That would be a great fit. Why not? Because he is such a calming influence. Chris Strevler, who, of course, we've just mentioned Miles Brown, and we know what happened in that incident. Chris Strevler, who's working his way back into health with that leg that was annihilated almost, he's a free agent, and the Bombers haven't made a move on him, nor has anyone else.
Chris Strevler's the enigma at quarterback because he's not a stereotypical quarterback. He brings some value, and again, you want to talk about a glue guy. We know the locker room in Winnipeg absolutely loves him. But if he's not a feasible number 2 guy, what is he on your team? And I think that's the question that a lot of teams are asking themselves right now. He's not the heir apparent that's going to come in and be the number 1 starter when somebody like Trevor Harris or somebody like Zach Collaros finally retires. He's got a role, but you've got to be careful with what that role is.
Well, Tommy Stevens now is a Saskatchewan Rough Rider, and we know from Calgary that Tommy Stevens was a third down monster because if he was out there, I think I can count on less than one hand how many times he was ever stuffed on a third down gamble. The Riders picked him up. Now, does Tommy Stevens have that same upside where he could be a starter in this league? Maybe. He's a little bit younger than Strevler, and maybe the Riders are looking long-term that way, although they do have Jack Cohn under contract. They've got Jake Maier under contract. And of course, Trevor Harris. They've 4 guys under contract. You've got to figure out what you're going to do with one of them anyway.
And that leaves Shea Patterson as the odd man out in Saskatchewan. Again, a guy that's had a couple of starts in the league. Some success, but no big 350-yard, 4-touchdown games or anything like that. Another young guy that might get another look.
He was 2-4-1 with the Rough Riders in his 7 starts last year. He gave the team a little bit of a shot in the sense that he was mobile and he could ad-lib fairly well. He would throw no-look passes. He got the team excited. I just don't know if you're a coach, if that's what you want from a quarterback. I was surprised that the Riders actually went after Jake Maier. Of course, Mark Mueller has a history with Jake Maier. Cameron Dukes is the other one that I'm really curious about. The Argonauts still haven't signed him. Now, is this a dollar thing again? Are the Argonauts saying, look, we're running up against a wall here with the top of the cap, even with this extra $400,000? Because they do have I believe the highest or second highest quarterback in the league playing for. Where does Cameron Dukes go if it's not Toronto? I don't know that there's another landing spot.
Yeah, we talked about number 1 guys being solidified. Number 2 is starting to take shape. And now you're fighting for the number 3 spot or end up on the practice roster. Journeyman Matthew Schultz is another one that the Red Blacks have brought in. So that's 4 quarterbacks in Ottawa. We know he's a guy that can jump into pretty much any offense if a starting quarterback goes down to injury. Again, a guy that's never really elevated to that number 1 quarterback, but a solid spot. And I think Dustin Crum took a little bit of a step back in Ottawa last year. So maybe bringing Matthew Schultz in behind Drew Brown can help stabilize things there a little bit more.
Dakota Prukop, Brian Scott, Dominique Davis. I believe Davis has finally called it quits. Logan Bonner, who had one game, probably a game he wishes he could forget, against the Edmonton Elks in Edmonton, the rematch, and throwing 5 picks. He's 27 as well. He's hitting the prime, but is he ready to be a starter in this CFL? That's what you got to decide. You got to see what that upside is, and given what he showed you, you have some questions.
Absolutely you do. And Calgary has allowed a couple of these guys to go because they did bring in PJ Walker as well, who had some NFL experience. It looked for a little while like he might be their number 1 choice moving on from Jake Mayer, and then they made the splash to bring Vernon Adams Jr. in. But Adams and Walker are a pretty good 1-2 punch. Yes, Walker's unproven in Canadian football, but he's got a pretty deep pedigree.
And as you say, they are a great 1-2 punch. They're very similar in the way they approach the game in terms of their mobility. It's sort of the same thing that you talked about last time with Edmonton. You don't have to change the game plan all that much if you go from Trey Ford to Cody Fajardo. They tend to do the same types of things on a football field.
Which, again, if we want to circle back to Chris Streveler, is the biggest problem in finding the fit for him. You don't want to completely have to retool how you call a game if your starting quarterback goes down. And that's what we had seen the Bombers have to do. They would bring Streveler in and he wouldn't throw the ball. You knew as a defense coming up against them that you're going to have to stop the run a lot more and not worry about the pass. Now, stopping the run with Brady Oliveira and Chris Streveler in the backfield is its own animal and not the easiest thing to do. When you're not worried about a deep ball, you can kind of pin your ears back and go after it a little bit.
And Ottawa was the team that he beat in his only start last year, and it was so vexing to me as to why Ottawa didn't respect the fact that they were just going to run at them all day, that they were not going to put the ball in the hands of Streveler to try to slice and dice. And Ottawa wound up losing that game because I think they got stubborn and just refused to think that he wouldn't throw the football. Streveler, I think he's another glue guy. He's the type of guy that people rally around. Winnipeg would love to have him, but is he their future? No. We're just going to develop Terry Wilson, and that's the guy, and he's going to be the one that will lead this team after Zach Collaros, because most likely, I mean, between you and me and all our listeners, I don't think we're going to see Zach Collaros in 2026.
I don't either. This is the last year of his contract. Grey Cup's in Winnipeg. This is his opportunity for a last hurrah. I don't think he's a guy that wants to play till he's 40. Trevor Harris sounds like he wants to play till he's 50. He wants to go beyond Fran Tarkenton, beyond
George Blanda,
Damon Allen, Anthony Calvillo. He just wants to keep going and going. I don't get that same vibe from Zach Collaros. He seems like a guy that's going to want to hang it up and go spend time and raise his family.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble Podcast. Audio worth watching.